So today we're going to discuss the voting disaster that occurred in Georgia and how it's just a big mess and people are not being able to vote who should be able to vote. So while we talk about this today, I'd like you to think about this quote. Keep this in mind. In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. That was Franklin D. Roosevelt. So that's kind of how we have to judge these things, because you never really get to the bottom of them. You never really know why voting stuff went a certain way. Why weren't machines available? Why didn't people get their absentee ballots? Why were specific people purged? You never really know the motivation or who actually was pulling the strings there. All you see are the outcomes. And this is why it's important. In politics, nothing happens by accident. We have to judge what our government is doing by the outcomes that we see, because that's the only story we have. We never get to see the middleman, which unfortunately makes it gives good cover for the bad actors who want to go in there and do bad things. And it's hard to find out what's actually going on. So let's take a look today. Okay, so we have to go by the outcome. So let's have a little bit of a review here. So in 2013, what happened was the Supreme Court essentially said, hey, we're not going to enforce this policing of states to make sure that even though there are areas that have historically tried to deny people their right to vote, we think that's old data. We're not going to police anything anymore. Game's wide open. And so guess what happens? It's becoming hard for people to vote. Not that it was ever perfect, but we're seeing worse and worse situations where the outcome is that certain parts of states, we saw this in Texas, we see this in Georgia, we're seeing this all over the place, where they basically are certain counties, certain districts not able to vote easily. Now, I'm going to let you guess. Do you think it's upper middle class white areas that are having trouble voting? Or do you think it's lower socioeconomic areas with more minorities? Which of those do you think it would be? If you had to choose one, which one do you think is having the voting problems? Yes, it is not the upper middle class white neighborhoods that are having problems voting. So, again, you look at the outcomes. Does it really seem it's just a big coincidence that the areas that are having trouble voting are the same groups of people that have been having trouble voting our entire history as a country, right? From not being able to vote at all, then being allowed to vote, and then basically all sorts of efforts trying to keep people from being able to vote. Which seems more reasonable here? It's pretty obvious. So, always some sneaky trick. Black voters in Georgia say state's primary meltdown was no accident, right? Now, again, we're not going to get direct evidence about what's happening here, but let's listen to what the mayor of Atlanta has to say. So her name is now being thrown around as a potential Biden VP candidate. Who knows, right? Who knows? But let's listen to what she has to say about the voting that occurred today.
And it is absolutely ridiculous. Coming out of 2016, specifically when there were so many questions about the integrity of our election, to be here again in 2020 under these circumstances, really, it's unacceptable. And Brooke, I can tell you, I requested an absentee ballot that I never received. I had a cousin call me today who has voted for the past 37 years. He said he showed up to vote at his precinct on yesterday, and he was told that he had been purged, and he was told because he's a convicted felon, which he's not. So I think the layers of the voter suppression and the breakdown in our election system in Georgia run very deep.
Okay, so what we're hearing right here, right? This isn't just some person. This is actually a powerful person, and she's having trouble voting, right? So the mayor of Atlanta having trouble voting. So she didn't get her absentee ballots. Relatives who went to vote and had been purged from the voter rolls. So the problem here is that this sounds familiar, right? It makes so much sense because we've already been seeing this happen. Other states throughout the year purging voter rolls. Other states not sending absentee ballots to the people who've requested them. So this ends up being an issue because it's a common tactic that's happening in all of these states, right? And one of the problems is in Georgia, the governor is basically saying, hey, we don't handle the voting. The voting is a local issue. So if the voting went bad, you look at Atlanta. Don't look at us. Look at Atlanta. That's on them. Well, that's problematic for a number of reasons. One, the governor is supposed to make sure that voting is working throughout the states. So if you see that a particular area is having trouble voting, the governor's supposed to step in and fix that, right? You're kind of the top one. Usually when we put someone in a position of leadership and they have people below them take care of duties, you don't get to then say, oh, well, that was so-and-so's job. You're the person in charge. You got to be responsible for it. And if you are the governor of a state and you know that people in your state are not able to vote, it is un-American to do anything short of everything you can do to make sure that everyone in your state gets to vote. The only alternative is you don't want them to vote. You don't actually want people voting. Right? That's the only explanation. If you look at the outcomes, this is happening because people don't want people voting. It doesn't have to do with, oh, well, there was some new machines and they didn't know how to use them and there was some issues. Those are all problems that are easily solved. The problem here is the people in charge don't want everyone to get to vote. Okay? If they did, they'd be voting. Because as the governor of a state, you have a lot of freedom of what to do with resources. And if you're really concerned that people aren't getting to vote, you'll fix it. So this again shines the light on why the Supreme Court is so important. And we don't get to pick the Supreme Court, right? We pick the people who pick the Supreme Court. And sometimes we pick the people who get to pick the people for the Supreme Court, and they don't even get to pick the people for the Supreme Court, right? Although in all fairness, the thing with Mitch McConnell not allowing Obama his pick did happen after this Supreme Court decision that we're talking about. However, these are the kinds of decisions we're going to continue to see because the Republicans are totally packing the courts. They're packing the federal courts at all levels, from the Supreme Court to the other federal courts. They are absolutely jam-packing those spots so that they can control the judiciary, so that when there are lawsuits over this kind of stuff, it's going to go the way of the Republicans. Okay, if you look at the actual facts, it is undeniable that there are efforts to keep people from voting, right? So this is a huge issue. This needs to be dealt with. I hope that the current protests that are going on continue to happen until some major, like real reforms happen in policing. And then what I hope we can do is turn our attention around to the democracy, right? Because it's going to be very hard for us to get any kind of legitimate work done in this country if we don't even have the right to vote protected, where every single American gets to vote. And that's pretty hard to argue against. Okay, we hear the Republicans doing it, but it's pretty hard to argue that every American shouldn't be allowed to vote, and not jumping through hoops and all this kind of nonsense that we're seeing where people aren't getting their ballots, people are being purged from the polls, from the voter rolls. None of that should be taking place, okay? And we need to get the democracy back on track in order to do that. So let's get a list going, right? Reform police departments in a major, meaningful way, and get democracy back on track so that everyone's vote counts and is meaningfully counted, and we don't have these ridiculous reasons why, oh, these people didn't get to vote, but here's the reason why. No, just how about if just everyone gets to vote? We just create a system that ensures that everyone gets to vote. And if you're in a state where people aren't being allowed to vote, then the feds should step in and say, you know what, when your state is handling voting correctly, you get to do it however you want. But when you're keeping people from voting, or you're doing an insufficient job, right? You don't have to prove wrongdoing. Just say, hey, you're not getting your people votes. We step in and fix it, okay? And these are things we need to keep in mind when we vote in November, right? And unfortunately, we don't have any good choices for president. One is not as bad as the other, but at all positions, when you're voting in November, keep in mind the police situation and democracy, right? Because we're going to have a hard time having any democracy left if we do this for another 4 years. All right. Thanks for checking out the video. Hit that subscribe button to check out all the new material as it becomes available, and we'll see you in the future.